My name's Jim Claborn. I write a column back when here locally for about 30 years and a couple of books, and was a long-time teacher. You know, to properly understand the history of this area, it's just sort of like an onion. You just have to take layers. An 80-year-old person today is very vital. 80-year-old person was born in 1937. They barely remember World War II, first televisions, first computers. 80-year-old person died in 1937, was born in 1857. They can barely remember the United States coming apart with the Civil War. 1876, they remember the first telephones, the first movies in the 1890s, the first automobiles, the first airplanes. They can remember the Roaring '20s and the start of the Depression. 80-year-old person that died in 1857 was born in 1777. And the United States at that time was only about 6 months old. So the whole history of this country can be wrapped up in 3 lifetimes. And the children that we got today, a lot of them are going to live to see the 22nd century. So all of this needs to be put in perspective of a lifetime. Now, the first settlement we know of in this area right here, there were a couple of indications that there were a couple of earlier English-speaking settlements. Up on the east end of the town, two fellows come in 1783, the same year that Britain signed a treaty saying that we could be the United States, the Treaty of Paris. 4 years later, 1787, we had people come into Morristown proper, the Marsh brothers, the Riggs, Stubblefields, and so on. The first church here in Morristown, the first church, the book of the first church still survives, the book of the membership, and it tells of 2 free black folks, Moses, free man of color, Elsie, free woman of color, members of that church. These people came here with the earliest pioneers when the whole area that's now the county more than likely didn't have 100, 150 people. So you have these free black folks that came here in the pioneer days, and their story's never been told. It's never been told. Education. The church was, they'd have little classes in the church. Sometimes a school year lasts 2 months. Benjamin Kitchen at Russellville had a little school. We live in the valley of East Tennessee. Clinch Mountains on one side, Smoky Mountains on the other side. This area, a lot of people don't think of this, but this area was the second largest food producer in the United States up till the Civil War. Shenandoah Valley was the first. So the agriculture brought some prosperity to this area, and we started opening up little academies, subscription schools where you'd pay a little bit to have your child educated for 2 or 3 months a year. And other families would teach people at home. People wanted to learn to read the Bible. That was maybe the only book around. Even up into World War I in 1917, 1 out of every 4 people in this area was illiterate, couldn't read or write. So education didn't come in here really, really strong until they passed a law after the Civil War, where taxes paid for schools. 1855, 6 years before the Civil War started, Morristown Incorporated as a city had 175 citizens. 175 citizens and 9 slaves. And there are indications that there were a couple of other free black families living in the area above today's library. They were working on the railroad that was being built at that time, the East Tennessee, Virginia Railroad. Civil War come, all the able-bodied men were away. All the old men, children, and women had to carry on. This area was fought over in the Civil War. They said all the trees were burned, for 5 miles around for firewood and different different armies came in here. One story, I read a letter from a girl that was on Main Street and talked about the army stampeding through here, fighting and leaving brass kettles and leaving supplies. They were retreating, and there was an old black fella that was, you know, like everybody, just one of those folks that everybody in town liked. And he'd got caught in that stampede and run over by the horses, and her little brother wrapped him up in a quilt and dragged him over. They were the only two that could do it. Dragged him over to a little bit on the west end of town and buried him. The Civil War ended in 1865. This place was desolate. All the food was taken. All the animals were taken. All the fences were burned. All the trees were burned. 1865, the war ended. We were a desolate place. Soldiers started coming back. This area was heavily Union. East Tennessee was heavily Union, but there was a pocket of Confederate sympathy inside the city of Morristown because of the mill here that ground wheat and flour. But 1865, the war ended, and folks started moving into town that had green dollars instead of Confederate money. And like the Presbyterians from New Jersey, two ladies came in here right after the Civil War and had a little building down near Bethel's church down there that they opened a school up for these free blacks and the freed slaves. And these people were starved for education. They were starved for a return to normalcy, and they'd attend that school from 10 years old to 60 years old to 100 years old. Two ladies that came here from the Presbyterian church, they left, but as soon as they left, Miss Almira Stearns moved in here and took over the school and made it continue. Miss Stearns' school, one of the students was a fellow named Andrew Fulton. Andrew Fulton is kind of ironic. He'd been sold as a slave right in the location of the school in 1861, and then he returned to Mrs. Stearns' school. So she was these two missionary ladies from New Jersey and Mrs. Stearns were the people that built the foundation for what became Morristown College. A real big impact came when Dr. Judson S. Hill came in here in 1888. And he hired Fulton as the first black teacher at his school. They needed black ministers. So they started the school as Morristown Seminary. And it developed into Morristown Normal and Industrial College. And here's the thing about it. 1881, when Dr. Hill, he established Morristown Seminary to prepare these ministers, and it became Morristown Normal Academy, and then Morristown Normal and Industrial College. What that did, it left this little town right here with in a unique position. Now, if you were a white person and you decided to go to college, you went to Carson Newman, that was expensive, or the University of Tennessee, and you had to pay to stay there, or East Tennessee State maybe. We had a group of educated blacks here who normally, one, were educated academically, and second, we had a second population that were trained in technical skills. So as time went by, when you needed a mechanic, when you needed a mason, and we had, an incredibly educated black population. When American Inca came here, this town, all of a sudden, in 1946, 1947, this town began to boom. I remember moving here when the population was 13,000, and it had only grown to 13,000 because of this American Inca. And I'm sure that one consideration in them moving here is that we had a population of people with industrial skills and in academic abilities. So Morristown College had a big impact on the progression of Morristown today. I think today the city's population is 50,000. So I've come from 13,000 to 50,000. And what happened is that so that everybody could get an inexpensive education, Walter State Community College came in here. They had the benefit of government money. They could build new facilities, hire young teachers, and charge less. So a big part, I think, of Morristown College's evolution came with the coming of Walter State, when everybody could get an education. Even prior to the Civil War and to emancipation. You know, everybody tends to like their own group, their own church, their own communities and stuff, and feel more comfortable. As one reason, and another reason may be necessity. But you started getting little black communities around here. Golder out on the Holston River. A lot of these communities were inclusive. They had their own stores, their own churches, their own, somebody, performed as a doctor. They were pretty well self-contained communities. Golder, Pineville up around Russellville, up at Whitesburg, Irvinville, out in Wick community, Little Africa, out toward Jefferson City, Rocktown, out toward Panther Creek Park, a group of Kyle families were living there. Out in the Alpha community, there's a small black community. These communities were all around, and the stories have never been really fleshed out. The free black families that came in here with the pioneers, the free black families that were here during slave days, these black communities. Early on, Morristown developed a reputation as a place for black kids to come for an education. I mean, they'd come from Claborn County, from Granger County, over here to go to Morristown College High School, to some of the black elementary schools. Morristown College High School, as a young white fella, you'd see these neatly dressed young folks walking from Morristown College to go down to downtown. You got to remember there's some poor white folks too, and my mother worked for a black lady. My mother sewed stuff for her. And it was always a joy to see her come over and pick up what my mother had sewed for her. And my mother'd have just a little money to get all of us kids a bag of candy. It was baby steps. This coming together was just baby steps. So what we do and how we handle it and how we think it through is going to depend on how these children today that are going to live in the 22nd century, what we're going to pass on to them. Every once in a while you have to shuck the corn. I mean, I've written these stories, go out and talk to old people for 30 years, that way out in Hancock County, everywhere. You're most likely not going to get elected to any office in this county unless you're a Republican. Now, it just goes back one lifetime. You got Union Grove Church, you got all this Union Methodist churches and Southern Methodist. This Civil War thing stayed around. Kind of little tiny fragments today. But all the older people that voted Republican, Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president. all the older people that their family were Union sympathizers. There's a man living today down here in Alpha. His father was from Granger County and fought with the Union Army. Slipped over here to Middlesboro, Kentucky. Over here in Middlesboro, Kentucky, and joined up. I mean, we had a lot of Union sympathizers. When the war was over, the Republicans about took over because they came in from the north with green money. The Helmses that started the Gazette Mail, just all sorts of families came in just as soon as that was over. And, the Jim Crow laws and all that stuff occurred, all that occurred under Democrats. Then, when Roosevelt took over and started a bunch of social programs, he was a Democrat, and it kind of reversed things a little bit. So you can still see in this area the older families. I mean, I've talked to 1,000 of them in 30 years. If they're staunch Democrats, they were normally Confederate sympathizers. They fought their grandfather, great-grandfather fought for the Confederacy. If they're Republicans, their grandparents normally fought for the Union, and that stays in the family. You're going to be heavily impacted on what your parents are. We have to get, I think, to prepare our kids for the 22nd century. We have to get used to saying that we are members of the human race and that we're not a political party, we're Americans, period.